Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Developments and Safeguarding Masterclass for October 2022. We've got some interesting talks today with what is sexual violence, harm, and what are the impacts, sexual abuse and perpetrator work, and safer recruitment. So, got some really good subjects for everybody here. Just a normal sort of admin-y kind of arrangements as well. But just to be aware of your environment, please. And if you have any, mic should be automatically muted for everybody. But if you do have any noises going on in the background, if you could please just make sure that your microphone's on mute. We are recording this session. We do just cut things out so that you can only see the picture that you're seeing on screen now and not the little side panel with everybody's faces or whatever, but just please be aware of that, so don't try and take control and show your camera and that sort of thing. And any questions, if you've got any, please add them into the talk. For everybody's information, all of our masterclasses are recorded and the slides are available on our website. So you'll be able to access them there, and you'll also be able to access on our YouTube channel. I would encourage everybody to please subscribe to the YouTube channel, because what that will do is then it will give you access to our latest YouTube videos as we upload them. Obviously, and you'll get, if you do the bell notification, you'll get a notification of that. But also, we need to get over 100 subscribers to the channel so we can name it, because otherwise we've got that horrible long UCU sort of name. So if you wouldn't mind, that would really help us out. So with that, I will pass over to IDAS to give the first part of today's talk.
Hi everybody, so thank you. So my name is Sam Beckett and I'm a project lead working for IDAS. I've been working for IDAS now for about 13 years. So I started off as a women's refuge worker, moved over to becoming an ISFA, and then over into becoming the project lead, so working with the sexual violence team and both of the young children's teams. And I'll let Donna introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Donna Clark. I'm a hub manager at IDAS. I've worked for IDAS for around 20 years. I've worked in the refuge, I've worked with children, I've been an outreach worker and a manager. I've also, alongside that, worked with probation with perpetrators for several years. So I've done a mixture of work, along with couple work in Barnsley for people who chose to stay together. So I've had quite a lot of different experiences. So that's me really. So I'll hand back to Sam to get started.
Thanks, Hayden. So next slide, please. Oh, my screen's frozen 1 minute. There we go. So we're going to be looking at what is sexual violence or harm, and what are the impacts. So this could go on for hours, but we're going to try and keep it short, 15 minutes before we move over. So there's many different types of situation that can result in sexual harm. So it could be either being pressured, blackmailed, manipulated, coerced. It's whenever there's a lack of consent, be that an active consent or kind of the unsaid consent, body language, etc. So it's when we're being pressured or physically forced by somebody to do or engage in sexual behaviours when you actually didn't want to. So if you've had a sexual experience of any kind when you were unable to consent, so perhaps being drunk or asleep, obviously by law, consent means that you've given permission and that somebody else has given you permission to engage in any intimate activity within sex. So any sexual activity without consent is illegal, and that doesn't matter what the age is of the people that are involved. So in UK, the age of consent for sexual activity is 16. But it's really important to remember that the law is designed to protect young people from abuse or harm or being taken advantage of by adults. It's not there to criminalise young people. So there's very little intention to prosecute two people under the age of 16, above 13 and under 16, where both people mutually agree or consent if they're within that similar age, so a 14 and a 15-year-old, etc. So, but as I said, anybody under the age of 13, it's illegal, it's viewed as rape or sexual assault, they're not able to give consent. So what does it look like? What does sexual harm look like? It's somebody pressuring or expecting somebody to have sex in ways that they didn't want to. So it might be that during a consensual sexual encounter, you're having vaginal rape, and then somebody decides that you're going to have anal rape and they won't stop, and you haven't consented to that. It might be that during sex you want to stop, but the other person refuses. It could be that you've had a sexual experience with somebody, but only because they wore you down by repeatedly asking you, that kind of coercive pushing, blackmailing and everything that we get. Rape or attempted rape or sexual assault is obviously part of sexual harm. It might be that somebody's threatened you either personally, professionally, sort of socially or academically, that they're going to share indecent images, they're going to tell people what you've done, etc., as a way of making you have sex with them. It might be that you've been made to watch porn, or engage in sexual activities that have been influenced by porn that you didn't really want to be involved in. So what we do is that's only a tiny little part of it. It could go on and on. So what we do know, though, is it's a crime that's typically motivated by the desire to control or humiliate or harm somebody. It's not usually about sexual desire. So our colleagues from Positive Choices are going to be talking a little bit more about the perpetrator behaviours and mindset side in a few minutes. So we're going to focus on the impact it has on a victim or survivor. Next slide, Hayden. So what are the potential impacts of sexual violence within a relationship, so both short-term and long-term? So we know that even one act of sexual violence or coercion can absolutely disrupt an entire career or life of a person. So sexual violence violates a person's trust and their sense of safety, and it can happen to absolutely anybody, regardless of age, gender, religion, or your social standing. So everybody responds really differently to being assaulted. So it might be that people become withdrawn, they may start to self-medicate, isolate themselves from others, be jumpy, be not sleeping. There can be loads of situations, and there can be some people where they don't have any of those in the beginning. That comes on later as they start to realise more clearly what's happened. If this happens when you're in a relationship, we're less likely to come forward and talk about it. That is kind of especially if they're slightly younger, or if it's one of their early sexual relationships, maybe a first boyfriend or something. Many clients talk to us about, we love the person, we just don't like the behaviours. And actually, if you love the person, oftentimes it's a case of almost putting up with the behaviours in order to stay within that relationship. Often we hear about a sense of denial and self-blame. If I hadn't, I should have, all of those things. But we know that their fear responses kick in. So if any of you know about Zoe Lodrick and her fear response is that fight, flight, friend, freeze or flop. Often in relationships, the one that we use most often is friend, freeze and flop. We try and get the other person on side. We know it's usually somebody we know, like or love. So trying to get them back on side is something that we would do quite easily. It's something that we fall back in, and Donna will talk a little bit about that when we go through the cycle of abuse. And then when we know that that's not stopping, then there's that freezing position. We don't fight back. We just tend to think almost rabbits in the headlight, what's going to happen? And then for some people, they're going to that flop, almost a disassociating. So then after that, we kind of are wondering, why didn't I fight back or shout out? And if we don't understand what those fear responses are, then that can be really difficult to understand. So most people think of somebody who's been raped or sexually assaulted, sorry, there's my son, or sexually assaulted as being bruised or battered or bleeding. But in reality, they're usually just a little bit dazed and confused. They might talk about feeling really numb. They might not remember what's happened. So that bruising is usually kind of almost an emotional bruising. So in the long term, it can lead to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, PTSD, the long-term kind of mental health conditions that have a massive cost implication on society. That's due to the needs for a long-term reliance on support packages from health services and things like that. Hayden, could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So within the World Health Organization, they did a survey and looked into that, and according to that survey, almost a third, or 27% of women aged between 15 to 49 years old who have been in a relationship report that they've been subjected to physical or sexual violence by their intimate partner. which, you know, it's absolutely massive. And we also know, we really do recognise that that's barely the tip of the iceberg. We know there's a lot underneath there that never come forward, who would never disclose it or talk about it, or even really realise that it's wrong, I think. Donna, do you want to take that for a bit?
Yeah, so taking on from there, a lot of victims that come through as victims of domestic violence often don't come through with any sexual abuse on referral. It's only when you get into that support with the client that you start talking about what's normal in their relationship, that you get to find where people are using sex sometimes to keep themselves safe. A feeling that, you know, particularly in heterosexual relationships, men need sex. So if you give them sex, they won't get angry. A little along the lines of, you know, they need it because of the testosterone. So if they release the testosterone, there'll be no violence. So taking on responsibility for behaviours. A lot of sexual assaults and rape, etc., in relationships are sort of said to be from perpetrators to victims, or victims take this on to be make-up sex, which often goes further than the victim will want it to be, but not wanting to escalate things again will go along with that. So as Sam said, it might start off as consensual sex, and then somebody might want, or the perpetrator might want to do something the victim doesn't, and there's a little bit, well, I thought we was okay now. So a little bit of pressure in that way. And again, you know, victims will often think, I didn't say no, he didn't pin me down, I could have, you know, just pushed him off or whatever. So they won't say that, you know, it wasn't consensual, because in their mind, not consensual is somebody dragging you behind the bush and raping you, because people's perception of rape isn't really in your family home in bed with somebody who you love to some degree. We often get a lot of sexual assaults as well, where strangulation, non-fatal strangulation is used in sex, so used as something that somebody will say they like doing. So you can imagine if you've got a domestic abuse situation and somebody's using strangulation and saying that's something they prefer to use because that's a sexual desire. So just I received an email from a victim out of area just last week, I think it was, and they engage in bondage as a couple, and I've invited other couples in, and now he's started doing things she doesn't want to do, but he's now openly ridiculing her in front of their friends because he's saying she likes it and then making it sound like she's changed the rules. So what he's done is he's pushed the rules, and he's now taking what she is happy with and ridiculing her in front of other people. So her friends are just laughing about it. So she's almost now sort of started saying to us, is it me? Is it, you know, almost like she hasn't really changed the rules. She just don't want what he wants now, but she's thinking that it's her that's changed the rules, so she's to blame. But actually, you know, consensually, she can change the rules at any point. But she's not getting that. She thinks it's her fault. She's changed the goalpost, etc. Aidan, can you just move on a little bit?
I think there's 2 slides to move on.
So I think for me, sexual violence, whether you hear about it or not, is always prevalent in a domestic abuse relationship. I've had people say there's no sexual abuse. I would personally, and I'd never say this to a victim, it's their experience, would say it's always there. Having worked with perpetrators and victims, I would actually suggest, if anybody's been abusive to you, how do you ever know you've got consent? Because how can that person ever be giving consent 100%, you know, able to say that if they're scared of you? You know, if there's a fear, there's always a chance that that person's just conforming to what you want. Cycle of abuse is a perfect example of that. So, you know, you get the tension building. Often in the tension building, victims will use sex to relieve tension. So they've got a partner who's angry, storming about, so they start playing up to them and maybe offer sex. Sometimes this is then pushed to limits that the victim doesn't want. I would say even the victim trying to stop an abuse by using sex may seem like it's the victim going to the perpetrator for sex, but is used to avoid violence and aggression, often around children. So to the extreme, I've known victims, you know, control, you could call it control, but manage the situation by having sex before children are due home from school. So there's no violence around the children, so social care don't get involved. So again, taking the responsibility that if I don't, there's going to be a blow up, the neighbours will call social care, so it'll be my fault. And then you have the incident, and if you have an incident, victims want it over with as quickly as possible. So then that might be the makeup sex. A lot of perpetrators, you know, having worked with them for years, will think that once you've had sex, whatever happened before that is done. We don't go back there. Likewise, victims will conform to that because they don't want to go back to the argument. So actually, I can't discuss that during this time you made me have a type of sex I didn't want. You can't go back there because if you blow it up again, you're to blame because you've started it, you know. And then you get to the honeymoon period, and actually, you know, people think of the honeymoon period as being a nice period, and for some victims the honeymoon period is just not being called horrendous names. You know, it's not what we would maybe perceive as the honeymoon period. But again, this can be a time when I don't want to say no to something because I know the tension building might be coming. And if I'm having a nice time, if things are quite nice at home, why would I want to blow it up? So I think that's a lot of it. I do know for a fact, having worked with victims who have been victims of stranger rape or, you know, child sexual, etc., there's always shame and blame. But I think when it's in a relationship, there's always a doubt that it's not the same. You know, I'm not like somebody who's attacked by somebody. I'm not like a child victim. I'm not. So they will take a lot of responsibility for it because in their mind, they're choosing to stay. We've got another slide, Sam?
Yes, please, Hayden. What do we do if we get a disclosure? So I think there's some things that you really need to be looking at if you do get a disclosure. It's that finding out if they're currently safe. Do they need medical help? Is the perpetrator going to be at home when they're going back? So therefore, where are we going to be sharing that information? Consider the SARC timeline. So the SARC is the Sexual Assault Referral Centre, and it's a one-stop shop for anybody who's been sexually assaulted. So it's considering the timelines. I would always suggest if somebody discloses something and it's been within a couple of weeks, you ring the SARC to see about if they can get in and if it's still within that forensic window. You're making sure that you make really, really clear notes after disclosure. You're using their words in your notes and you're ensuring that you were checking and adhering with your own agency's safeguarding policies. We know that families can be really well-meaning, but occasionally not helpful. So you have to tell, you have to stop stop them from doing it to somebody else or her from doing it to somebody else. We know it's not clients' responsibility to stop perpetrators doing this to other people. So we support the client with that by not pushing or making them doing something, and also about considering your own unconscious bias, and so not putting your own thoughts and views. I remember going to see a young client at school, and the secretary said, well, would you really have had sex with your boyfriend the next day? Well, we don't know what relationship that was like with her boyfriend the day after being raped by somebody she doesn't know, and it may be that's how she proved to him that she loved him and that it was rape from the other person. Can we have the next slide, Hayden? Thank you. So some do's and don'ts. So if you've got a client in front of you and they don't want to report, don't pressure them. They don't have to report. There is other options. They could do something like anonymous intelligence. It's about allowing them a bit of space, allowing them time to talk through things and consider what they actually want to do. Looking at a SARC referral, as we mentioned before, encouraging the clients to access support from agencies who are specifically trained to understand the impact. So that might be to the years for service. Consider the sexual health. Is there any possibility they could be pregnant or have caught some form of sexual health disease or anything? Allowing them time to process, not pushing them. They're not going to be able to tell you everything straight away, but it's about being open. It's about asking them that professional curiosity. So when they say, oh, it's a bit pushy, I'm a bit uncomfortable when she does this, it's about asking what does that mean and allowing them in their own words to speak and let's talk about it. Managing their expectations. You're not going to be able to keep secrets or anything. Considering safeguarding, certainly if they're under 16, and looking at what you would do, considering your own support needs. So do you need to speak to your manager, or could you ask your manager for external supervision? You may not have gone through something like this, but as we've already seen, a third of all people have. So you a really good chance that either if it's not you, it's going to be somebody close to you who will have been. And this stuff can really impact on us. I've got a case that we got not long ago, and the 2 young people involved in it were the same names and ages as my 2 kids, and it just, I couldn't manage it in the end. It went to a different worker because I recognised that every time I started to speak about it, I could see my own kids in my head, not their head. Considering your terminology, think about what it is that you're saying. You know, we don't have to prostitutes. It's not love. It's different. Stalking and harassment is not, you know, love or anything. And being aware not to continue myths and stereotypes. We know that those myths and stereotypes are what stop people from coming forward anyway. So not ongoing them. It doesn't matter what somebody was wearing or how they're responding. That doesn't mean that what they're telling you, it doesn't happen. It might be that they're numb. It might be that they're talking about it really straightforward as if it had happened to somebody else. It might be that they're sobbing and hysterical. It might be that they're shouting and they're angry. All of those are really normal ways to deal with it. Now, I think that the next slide, if you just have a look, Hayden, I think that's moving on. Oh, yeah. So what do you do if you have a disclosure or any concerns? Donna, we've literally got seconds. Do you want to take this one?
I'm on mute. You think we'd have got used to that. So for victims of domestic abuse, our risk assessment is the dash, and it will tell us how much risk there is in lots of ways, you know, but always to consider, you know, if it's not physical risk, it could be emotional, it could be risk to self. So to consider that, to consider the SARC, because some people will say, I'm not reporting, I'm not going through all that. And actually, when they've had a couple of days to get their head together, they want her, and then them samples, etc., will be stored. Also to remember things like, if you've got somebody who's just been raped, to, you know, tell them not to have a drink, tell them not to have a cigarette, tell them not to, you know, if that's what they want at that point to report, they have to not, you know, there might be something they need to do orally, so you know they need to be aware of that. So we are, because you know, I don't do the ISVA work generally, my sexual abuse is within victims, we don't have a lot of engagement with the SARC. So if you don't understand, ring them up and ask them, or ring our ISVAs and ask, you know, they have masses of knowledge that they can share with you, and also have options. You know, what do people want to go to refuge to get away? Do people need target hardening items from us to keep safe at home? Do we need to put aspire markers on with the police in case this person comes around? You know, lots of things that will help people not feel to blame and you know, feel safer. And also, as Sam said, mainly the myths about, you know, you aren't to blame for this is what somebody else has done. And things, you know, well-meaning people, as Sam said, you know, a lot of victims get told, they're like, oh, well, I've heard that not many sexual violence cases go to court. You know, victims of domestic abuse get told that all the time, oh, you'll be lucky to get a conviction. But the bottom line is, for a lot of victims, it's been believed. It's not, they're not always bothered what people get at the end of the criminal, you know, they're just bothered that that police officer or that person believed what they said. So I'll leave you to it now, Aidan, and move on for foundation. We don't want to take all the time.
Thanks, Donna.
Okay, thank you. So I'll hand over to Foundation for their part of the presentation.
Hi, thanks very much, Donna and Sam. That was a really great presentation. So we're just going to be moving on to our part of it. We are Positive Choices from Foundation, and we are a perpetrator service. It's a voluntary service for perpetrators of domestic abuse, where we'll take them through opportunities to recognise, acknowledge and change their abusive behaviour. We work with clients aged 16 and up, regardless of gender or sexuality. My name is Adam and I'm delivering with my colleague Veronica. Veronica will be manning the chat. If anyone has any questions, just put them in there and we will do our best to answer. Right, so can I have the next slide, please, Hayden? Okay, so this is our outline of our behaviour change programme. So just wanted to sort of highlight that we do work on sexual respect specifically for a 3-week period in our behaviour change programme, focusing on what is sexual abuse, what is sex and sexual boundaries. So those are our sessions to do with sexual abuse. We offer a rolling program, so clients don't always start on like module number 1, but we would never start a client on module number 5 because it's much safer for victims and clients alike to get them into the flow of working and recognizing their abusive behavior before we introduce sexual respect. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so in large part, what makes sexual abuse a difficult topic to navigate with perpetrators is the assumptions that, to be honest, we are all quite prone to making when we hear the word sexual abuse and rape. So often when people hear these words, they think of sensationalist headlines such as the one shown here reporting a woman attacked by a stranger in an alleyway. As Donna said, there's a massive disparity between people who have been raped by a stranger and people who have been raped in a relationship. And people don't normally connect it. They think if it's someone that I love, if it wasn't extremely violent, then how could it have been sexual abuse? So the first thing that we do on our sexual respect module is trying to get perpetrators to realize that sexual abuse is a lot more nuanced than just what they may expect. Could I have the next slide, please? You'll have to excuse me, I'm recovering from something. So sexual abuse, as professionals, we know that it's very complicated, but communicating that to perpetrators and of course victims can be quite difficult. So it can include things like working people up for sex, introducing pornographic materials or taking pornographic materials, unwanted sexting and harassment, interfering with contraception, the quote unquote locker room banter style of jokes and comments that are sexually degrading. And particularly with younger people and with technology evolving the way that it is, a lot more common are the things like the inappropriate text, the sexting, the revenge porn, because especially with sexting, people might not even realize that sexting can be an offence. But as the Sexual Offences Act outlines, it's an offence to take, make, or distribute images of anyone under 18, even if that person gives consent. So trying to get perpetrators to understand how complex sexual abuse is always our first step. And it's why we always start the module with that session on what is sexual abuse. So we move them from that understanding of sexual abuse as like a one-off violent event to what it actually is, which is a complex pattern of behavior around sex and violence. So if we can have the next slide, please. So these are our steps to change. Of course, we can tell perpetrators all of this and get them a better understanding of what sexual abuse actually is, but that needs to be applied and implemented in a way that is constructive and conducive to behavior change. So we have sort of 4 vague steps. These aren't linear. People often go from one to the other and back and forward, but this is the path that we try to get people on. The first is realization, as we've sort of alluded to, trying to make people realize that they themselves may have used sexual behavior. And again, this is the reason that this module never comes first, is because that realization can be quite jarring for victims and perpetrators alike. So we would introduce them to the fact that they are abusive first, and then introduce the fact that they might be sexually abusive, because people who have admitted to the fact that they have used physical violence have said to me and have said to other professionals, well, I'm not sexually abusive because I never force her, or I never force him, or I never force them. So when we get to that realization, we then start working on understanding. So understanding what the dynamics of that abuse entail. Things like, as Donna said, if you've used abuse and violence in a relationship, how can you be sure that sex is ever consensual? Because how do you know that that person's not just trying to de-escalate the situation? Then we'd work on application, so applying all of that knowledge, that realization and understanding to their own behavior, using tools such as conflict logs, scenarios, and sexual boundaries exercises. And all of those activities will be implemented by providing strategies for behaviour change. So one of the activities that I really like as a facilitator is our activity on sexual boundaries and sexual respect. So in that activity, we present perpetrators with a series of questions on sexual respect and sexual boundaries. And we get them to think about their own boundaries, think about their current or previous partner's boundaries. And then also we ask them to fill out statements relating to sexual respect. That activity comes towards the end of the module, and it's a good sort of plenary session so we can assess, do they actually need some extra support trying to change their behaviour here? Have they really understood? Or have they are they making progress, and is this something that we can continue working on as we go through the rest of the programme? So for example, one of the questions is, the next time my partner and I have sex, how can I make sure that they aren't scared? Which is a really, it's one that often gets them thinking, especially if they've been having trouble connecting to the fact that they themselves might be sexually abusive. After we've showed them the scenarios about fear and respect and crossing boundaries, that can be one that really makes them think. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so of course, we've got the steps to change, but we've got to make sure that the change is actually happening. So there are many indicators of change that we can look for within perpetrators. And sorry, someone's just wanting to get in. So there are many indicators of change that we look for within perpetrators. So I'm just going to run you through a few of the ones that we feel are the most important for this module and this topic. So first of all is a reduce in denial and minimization of sexually abusive behavior, because if we don't have them, if we don't have that reduction in denial, then we can't really get anywhere. So that is the first thing that we look for. We also look for a development of an understanding of sexual abuse within a relationship. So that is very much relates to that phase 2 of those steps of change, understanding that they themselves might be sexually abusive, understanding what sexual abuse entails and how power and control impacts that. We will also look at understanding the role that sex can play in violence and abuse, and how violence and abuse impacts on consent. Because, as we've said, how can you be sure that when you're violent and abusive, your partner is consenting? And then, crucially, we look at becoming able to establish and maintain healthy sexual relationships and boundaries, because that is the proof of all of the work that has been done, that people are able to go on and maintain healthy sexual relationships. Because if not, then they haven't changed. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so we'll all be very familiar with disguised compliance for many professionals. For us, we get a lot of disguised compliance, and it generally looks like a perpetrator giving the appearance of accepting responsibility for their abusive behavior to avoid raising suspicions. So we don't challenge them, so they don't have to face that uncomfortable realization. Like I said, we're a voluntary service. We're quite a long service. Our behaviour change interventions are generally 20 weeks and longer, between 20 and 26 weeks. So it is a long process, and sitting in that discomfort for a long time is difficult. That's not to say that's not necessary, but it can be difficult. So it's interesting that Sam was pointing out the 5 trauma responses, and you highlighted the friend one. So we also see the friend response from perpetrators, but they will direct that towards us. So if I had £1 for every time a client called me mate, then I would be a very rich man indeed. And it is to diffuse that tension of, oh yeah, well, I promise I am listening to you. I promise I am taking it all in. And like, look, I'm calling you mate. I'm having a good rapport with you. So we do often see that where people will act the part, but you can tell that there isn't really anything going in properly. It isn't really affecting their behaviour in the long run and in reality. So we're very lucky to work with a wide range of agencies that have regular contact with victim and family. So I think So agencies like IDAS, like Children's Social Care, we have regular attendees at MARAC. And we also have a dedicated victim liaison officer who will talk to the victim if they consent to a service. And that way we can have the victim voice as well as the perpetrator voice to make sure that they're on the right track. And that is the most vital tool in finding out whether or not a perpetrator is doing everything that they say they're doing. And often when we are faced with disguised compliance, we will first see it in those discrepancies between victim and perpetrator and what people are saying. Very, very often we will have someone who is apparently engaging well on group. Very often in terms of disguised compliance, I should say, not in terms of client base. Very often we find out disguised compliance in terms of there is someone who's engaging very well on group, seemingly, and then we hear something from the victim liaison officer or from an IDAS worker or from social care, and it will say completely the opposite. So at that point, we need to challenge that disguised compliance, because otherwise there isn't going to be any meaningful change made. But of course, this has to be done with the safety of the victim and family in mind. So we have, especially when the perpetrator might be still living with victim, might still be in contact, might still be living in the family home or have regular contact with the family home, we need to be making sure that they don't go back to the victim and say, oh, well, what have you been saying to Positive Choices? What have you been saying to IDAS? What have you been saying to social care? Because that can just escalate it so quickly. So what we have found is that we try to rely mostly on those indicators of change, on the perpetrator's behaviour and their comments and their narrative. Often with disguised compliance, there are inconsistencies within the perpetrator's narrative themselves, but also the perpetrator is aware that we work with multiple agencies. So when we know that a perpetrator is disguising their compliance, we might often frame it from I got a call from your social worker, or I got a call from your probation officer. And we will point these inconsistencies out and then gently challenge them using a naive inquiry. So that could look something like, I'm just a little bit confused because you've said this, but then you've also said this. Could you explain to me what you meant by that? Have I misunderstood? So that takes the onus off the perpetrator of, instead of saying, you've been lying and I found out, it's, I think I've misunderstood what you've said. Could you clarify? At that point, they tend to backpedal. They tend to realize they've been caught out. But since we've struck that balance between accusatory and collaboration, they don't really have anywhere to go. So whatever threads that we can unpick from that, whether they be small or large, whether they admit that they're not doing as well as they thought, or if it's just an inkling of the fact, well, yeah, maybe what I said there wasn't quite true, then we can start talking about, okay, well, why do you use that behavior? Why do you feel the need to have that control over your partner's sexual boundaries? Do you feel that that makes you feel more secure? Or do you think that makes your partner feel? And then we can get them back onto that path towards change and behavior change quite easily. They had a message in the chat from Sam. Do you do any, from Donna, sorry, do you do any work on what they gain from the abuse and how they will manage this loss? Yes, we do. We do a good deal of work on what we gain from abuse and how we manage the loss. Generally, we do that on modules such as emotional intimacy and support and trust. So those ones that sort of bookend the sexual respect module. So we work a lot on what people want from relationships, what people get out of relationships, expectations and desires, and whether or not the abuse is a positive or negative factor in that. And often people will say, yeah, it's a positive, it helps me stay in control. But recognizing that makes it far easier for us to say, okay, but how does that make your partner feel? So are they getting what they want? you're saying that it is a good thing and it gives you control, but you've ended up here. At the point that they've engaged with us, it's a voluntary service. They have had to recognise that there is something wrong. So we really, really try to build on that recognition, no matter how small it might be, to unpack the sort of power imbalances at play. And most of all, we just use professional curiosity. It is the greatest tool for anyone working in this field, as we all know. And it is the best way to unpack discussions about nuanced topics like sexual respect. And I think that is our slides. I think that might be us. I'm back over to IDAS.
Sorry, yeah, it was just our how you get hold of us, and then I think the next one is how you get hold of you.
Yeah, so those are our contact details there, and then there's also some resources that we use on the program.
Okay, thank you very much for both those presentations. I'll hand now over to Susan to talk about safer recruitment.
Hello there. Sorry, just going to get my camera and mic working. The session for the rest of this is on safer recruitment. Just want to go on to the first slide, please, Hayden. I think just in terms of safe recruitment, we just need to just remember where it came from. There's recently been a TV programme about SOAM and Ian Huntley, and of course safe recruitment came from the Bishard inquiry that happened post-SOAM, post the murders of Jessica and Holly at the hands of Ian Huntley. So prior to that, and that was 2003, there was no such thing as safer recruitment in most organisations. It wasn't a factor that was considered, it wasn't an area that they looked at. But clearly in terms of the recruitment of Ian Huntley and the implications that that then had, safe recruitment practice came into place. So that's where it comes from. So in terms of safe recruitment, it's one of the key elements to safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children and young people. So if we recruit the right people that will work safely with our youngsters, young people and children, then we have better outcomes for them. So it's important that all the principles of safe recruitment are applied to organisations who recruit individuals, both in a paid capacity but also in a voluntary capacity. I think sometimes we're quite good at recruiting staff that are paid in employment. We're less good at recruiting staff in a voluntary capacity. We have less comprehensive processes. And I think what we're trying to do is to do several things. We're trying to make sure that people who are not suitable to work with children don't apply in the first place. And also, if they do apply, how do we ensure that we understand that they might not be suitable and also stop them being appointed? We also need to have in place policies and procedures so that if somebody has been appointed, that we minimise the opportunities for them to harm children, and that we make sure that there are processes in place where people who have concerns about their behaviour can report those, and also that any allegations of harm are reported promptly as well. Thank you, Hayden. Can you just click that one through? This is an old piece of research, but it is still fairly relevant. There are some individuals who will choose to come to work with children because they have a sexual interest in children and will choose to access organisations, environments where they can have access to children in order to harm them. And we know from the research that's here, even though it's old research from 2004, that it's not unusual that individuals are aware of their interest before they actually come into work with children. They've possibly already offended in relation to children, and or it's part of their motivation to do so. So we do understand that that's the case. We also understand that some people will come into work with children without that understanding, but then have the opportunity to harm a child, abuse a child, and once they're in employment. So it's not actually a very straightforward area in terms of being able to predict. Thank you, Hayden. Just a quick comment in terms of staff who physically harm. It's a very different profile. Most of the staff who, adults who go ahead to sexually harm children is premeditated and planned. The majority of staff who end up physically harming children or physically harm children deliberately is usually reactive, rarely proactive, less commonly organised or sadistic. It's just the factors that we see And some of the things we see in terms of risk factors are individuals who have poor self-restraint, inability to manage challenge, conflict in the workplace, inability to respect boundaries of physical intervention. Some individuals view that it's okay to hit, smack children. Clearly it's not. Or have an inflexible approach to behaviour management, poor behaviour management skills. So they're actually, when they're dealing with a child who is struggling, they're not actually supporting the child to get into a better place. They're actually making things worse for the child. And in some cases having unrealistic expectations of children. I think some of the delegates here today are from nurseries. You know as well as I do that if you expect a 2-year-old to sit down for more than 2 seconds, they aren't going to do that. And if you ask them to do things, they aren't always very biddable. And so it's just having expectations that are realistic in terms of the child or children that they're working with. Thank you, Hayden. Again, we might see individuals who have poor boundary keeping, who breach policies and procedures because they know better, who have poor awareness of their behaviour and the impact of that on other people. And again, you've seen some of these from, again, some of the high profile cases that you'll be well aware of, where their personality meant that people found it very difficult to challenge. So although there were concerns, that individuals that were around those concerns actually didn't feel comfortable, confident, felt rebuffed in terms of those areas. So that's kind of some of the things we understand. So let's have a think about safe recruitment. Go on to the next slide, please. So within your organisation, you should have a clear policy statement, which is your child protection policy that outlines your commitment to safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children. All staff and all volunteers should be aware of that at induction, should be aware of it through ongoing training. And within that policy, you should have some mention of recruitment and selection procedures, what those look like, that they are robust, and so that should also be clear within your policy statement, not only just in terms of managing concerns about children, but how you manage the recruitment of staff to work with your children. Thank you, Hayden. So the key principles that we're operating on are these. First of all, we're trying to ensure that unsuitable applicants don't apply. And the way we do this is by putting out a very clear message about our organisation when we're looking to recruit staff. This is one of the reasons you put on your adverts, you know, safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children, making people aware that they would be going through DBS checks. So those individuals who would have difficulties getting a clear DBS don't apply. Those individuals who look at your organisation and think, actually, this is an organisation that understands safeguarding, understands child protection. Perhaps if my intentions towards children are not as they should be, this is not the place I want to work, because this might be an organisation that will find me out or stop me doing what I want to do. So part of that is you having clear child protection policies. If you have a website, having them on there so that people looking at your organisation will think, actually, I'm not going to apply there because I can't behave in the way I would wish to behave. Again, it's making sure that through your selection stage, through your interview process, whatever else you put candidates through, and all your pre-appointment checks, that you're making sure that people are suitable to work with children. Be that, you know, the questions you ask them, be that the exercises they undertake, be that your references and other pre-employment checks, DBS checks that you do, so that within your process you've got clear stages of understanding that somebody might be unsuitable so that you can reject them at that stage. And again, once you've got individuals in place, it's preventing opportunities to abuse. So it's thinking about how do people work, particularly if they're new to you, how do you supervise them? How do you make sure that people know through safe working practice, for example, codes of conduct, what they can and can't do? Are you clear in your nursery settings about phones? And all the kind of things that you're well aware of, making it very clear to individuals that work with you that what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and also that you pick up all the low-level issues. So somebody that just steps slightly out of line, and that might be because they're testing the boundaries, or it may be that they actually don't know what being in line looks like. And so it's making sure that all the low-level concerns are quickly addressed, training put in place where it's appropriate, sanctions put in place where it's appropriate, so that again it's going to check people's opportunities to harm because either they think they can get away with it or because they don't know any better. And I think it's again, as we've said it here, detecting and responding to concerns. And so if concerns do arise, that you raise them appropriately, be that with myself, the LADO, if it meets our threshold, or discussing whether it could meet the threshold with us, making sure that we respond appropriately to that. And where somebody has behaved in a way that gives us concern about their suitability to work with children, that we follow that through robustly, be that through a disciplinary process, and where we've got somebody who is removed from our employment, that we make referrals to DBS for consideration of barring. Thank you, Hayden. So I mentioned before advertising, it's important that when you're advertising your posts that you state your commitment to safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children, that the advert information you provide to candidates, that they clearly understand that the role is subject to DBS clearances and barred list checks where that's appropriate. So that this is seen as a deterrent. It's seen that if you place yourself out there as an organisation that understands safeguarding, has good robust procedures, candidates who are unsuitable will choose not to apply, and that makes our lives much more straightforward. It's making sure within your job description, person specification, or if you have a role profile for volunteers, that the responsibilities relating to safeguarding are very clear, that people are clear what their role is and also what their role is not, what you don't expect them to do, so that you can challenge people. You can recruit to that, but when people are in post, you can challenge them in terms of why you're doing that and or why you're not doing that. I know that some of our settings don't always use application forms and often use CVs. I think the difficulty with the CV is it gives an individual an opportunity to hide things that you would find if you had an application form. So if you are accepting CVs, please make sure that you're checking for gaps in employment. Please make sure that you're looking at dates and start and finish dates of posts. One of the things that CVs sometimes allow people to do is to say, I worked somewhere between 2000 and 2001, and an application form would give you a month. If you haven't got a month, actually 2000 to 2001 could be 2 years or could be 2 days. And one of the things we're trying to establish from an application form is whether there are gaps in employment, so that we can question what happened, why there was a gap. And sometimes that might indicate that somebody was left an employment at short notice or was dismissed. And so there might be a gap in terms of that. I do appreciate that a lot of settings don't have application forms, but if it is possible for you to use them and establish those, then it is better practice. Thank you, Hayden. References has been a sticky point for quite a few years now. Lots of organisations giving references will only give start and finish dates and very little else. We should be asking specific questions about safeguarding concerns relating to individuals. We should be asking if there are any concerns about somebody's suitability to work with children. Depending on where they've come from, they may not have worked with children previously, so you may not get that information, but it's important to try and get good and accurate references. The best practice that's advised is at least 2 references, and one at least from their current employer, and if that employer isn't with children, the last employer where they worked with children. I know sometimes that's difficult for individuals coming straight from school or who've had breaks in employment. The other thing in terms of references, just to bear in mind, if you've got 2 references that are offered to you, but they both cover a very short period of time, you might actually want to take more than 2 references so that you've got a longer period of time referenced. So let's say you've got a couple of the most recent references, somebody's worked where they are currently for a couple of months and previously, let's say, for another couple of months, but prior to that they worked somewhere for a longer period of time. That might be a reference you want to take as well. So it might just be worth you are thinking in references about a time period to reference rather than a number of references, because you're trying to understand how somebody worked in the employment that they had and what skills, experience, knowledge, etc. will they bring into your role. Do always follow up references if you've got things in them that you're not sure about, that aren't clear, and you can always follow up the references in terms of the applicant as well. But it's the applicant's responsibility to provide references for you. When you're doing your selection processes, you'll use a range of things, interviews, working with the children and young people, and all those kind of things. You're also trying to explore not only how they'll do the work, but also their motivation. Why do they want to work with your children in your setting, in your school? Particularly where you've got children with additional needs, particularly where you've got children who might be challenging. Do they really understand the challenges that will face, and do they really have the skills, motivation? What is it that motivates somebody to want to work with children and with your children? All of you who've done recruitment will be aware there's a plethora of pre-employment checks, identity checks, rights to work in the UK, registration, etc. Just make sure you do those robustly and make sure you see as far as you can original documentation. It is very easy for people to get copies, falsify documents. Well worth you getting those, insisting on original documentation as far as it is possible to do. And again, health checks will be part of your process, is making sure somebody is well enough to work in your organisation or setting. Thank you, Hayden. DBS checks, I think we've got schools and settings here predominantly. You'll need to understand and determine, and you already will have this in place, whether a DBS check is needed, and largely it will be, and what level of check is needed for individual posts. And you need to make this clear to applicants before they apply for the post, what level of checks are going to be done, whether it's DBS and or barred list checks. There's plenty of information online in terms of that. Largely for most schools and settings, we have individuals who are in regulated activity with children and therefore have requirement to have a DBS certificate and a barred list checks. In terms of barred list checks, individuals can be barred for a number of reasons from working with children, usually as a result of serious concerns about them. One of the peculiar situations is somebody can work supervised if they are barred from working with children. I'm not sure why you wish to do that, but technically that is the case. I think the vast majority of individuals you'll have with yourselves will be potentially working unsupervised with children, and therefore you'll be looking at DBS disclosure certificates and barred list checks to be put in place. But there is quite a lot of information online in terms of that if you're not sure about it. Thank you, Hayden. Yep, what the DBS check will show, it'll show cautions and convictions, except some of those that are called protected or spent. So some very old convictions where there's a one-off and it's a long time ago, perhaps when the adult was a child, will not be on certificates. It's very unlikely that anything that is not on a certificate would cause you concern about employing that individual. In addition to that, as determined by, I think it's the Chief Constable, information that's soft information, which is non-caution and non-conviction. And that might include some of the information from my kind of processes, from the LADO process, where there's been an investigation and the police are aware of that. They will determine whether that's disclosed on a DBS check. It's important for us just to remember that it doesn't say somebody's suitable to work with children. It says we know no reason why they're unsuitable. And therefore, DBS checks are part of your much bigger process in terms of references, in terms of suitability. So don't just rely on your DBS checks in terms of somebody suitable and safe recruitment practices. It will tell you some very specific information about cautions and convictions. The vast majority of cases that come into the LADO team relate to individuals with clear DBS certificates, even when they've been arrested for very serious offences. I can't think of any examples except very, very rarely when there has been anything at all on the certificate or anything on the certificate that would cause us any difficulties. So when individuals are employed with children and they come to the attention of the police will largely make contact with us to make us aware of that, which is why the first time that somebody is caught is the first time it comes to our attention. And largely before that, we're talking about individuals who've got clear DBS checks. So again, just to remind you, they are important to do, but they're not necessarily the most important part in terms of suitability. So other things that we need to have in place, clearly you'll have good induction in place, good training in place, ongoing training in safeguarding, so that staff are very clear about safe working practice, code of conduct, what your expectations are of them, how they will work, when they can do certain things. You'll have clear policies in place, including whistleblowing policies, and clear and appropriate supervision through people's employment, and also making sure that you have guidance for reporting concerns within my procedures, the allegations procedures, so that staff know when and how to report concerns, either directly to you as the manager of the setting or head teacher within the school, or directly to the LADO if there are concerns about the manager of a setting and there's nobody else to refer that to. And the bottom link is to the allegations procedures, and on that site as well is the referral form for LADO as well. Just a couple of lessons learnt. Again, this will be cases you're probably well aware of. This was the Plymouth Little Ted's case back in 2009. And again, I put this one in because we just need to be aware of some of our prejudices, and we tend to have an assumption, and it's reinforced by lots of things, that it's men who abuse children and not women, and clearly in this case it was a female. And here it just talks about a lot of difficulties and weaknesses within the organisation. She was fairly senior within the organisation, and people felt unable to challenge her. So some of her practice and her day-to-day activities were of concern. The staff didn't know how to raise it. If it was raised, it wasn't taken forward. And again, we were working within here an organisation where governance and oversight was poor. And again, lack of training for staff, policies and procedures not strong enough, so that when concerns arose, people didn't know what to do about it. And you'll be well aware of this case and her conviction for very serious sexual offences against children that she worked with in the setting. Again, probably aware of this case. This was a male working in a Little Stars nursery in Birmingham. Again, one of the difficulties with this case is very poor recruitment practice. He probably started and was working unsupervised before he'd even qualified, but he was known to, his mother was best friends, I think, with the manager of the setting. So he was in a position of power within the staff group. So although his behaviours were clearly unacceptable and clearly very unsafe and dangerous, the policies, the procedures, the organisation, the supervision was such that he went unchallenged for a long time, so that he was able to perpetrate significant harm on a child that was at the nursery. And again, it's probably a case that you're aware of. Just pulling up a couple of school cases. Ian Huntley, as I said before, convicted back in December 2003, was the individual in a sense that started the safe recruitment work being looked at more seriously and started the development of policies and procedures in relation to that. There were significant recruitment issues in relation to Ian Huntley. He brought a CV. There were lots of difficulties with that. DBS checks were called something different in those days. However, the checks weren't done as robustly as they should have been done, and also some of the way that police held information meant that information on him wasn't given to the school, the college. I mean, for example, there was a child who had a child by him, a girl under the age of 16 had a child by him, so therefore there must have been some illegal activity in relation to that child, but because there'd been no conviction for it, that information was never disclosed. So again, Ian Huntley formed the starting point of our safe recruitment, but it also tells us something that I think we sometimes have forgotten about this case, that Ian Huntley didn't work at the school that Holly and Jessica attended. He worked at the college, and the two little girls were at the primary school, and their contact with Ian Huntley was through the teaching assistant who worked with them. So they knew her, and it was their contact with her that made them think that he was a safe adult. So I think the other thing is CRB checks, isn't it, Hayden? Yeah. So I think one of the things there that we know with Maxine Carr is that, you know, the children recognised her as a safe person because she worked in a school, and Ian Huntley was therefore safe because he worked also at a different school, but also was her partner. So it's that transferable risk, isn't it, in terms of children's understanding of who is safe, people and safe places. And the last one just to mention there is a case from an independent school from the South Bank of London of an individual who systematically abused a number of children over very many years. And the difficulty here was that his partner was the chief executive of the organisation that ran the school. He was absolutely bomb-proof. Nobody was going to challenge him. He wasn't even a very good teacher, let alone the other things he was doing, but he was absolutely bomb-proof. And therefore, just thinking about the circumstances where you have, individuals who are related to each other within the organisation and the complexities that brings as well. I think just in terms of lessons learned, I think we have to accept that it happens and does happen in the best of our schools and settings. We have to have a belief that it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. We need to understand that good recruitment practices will deter unsuitable candidates. Good induction training and supervision and clear expectations will deter and then detect. But also that we need to just have in our minds that people will slip through the gap. We know the grooming process, we understand the grooming process. Where children have been groomed, we absolutely understand and accept that the adults around them, be it parents, carers and staff, will have been groomed as well. And therefore we just need to keep it in the forefront of our mind that it could happen anywhere, and to pick up any low-level concerns that we may need to address with an individual or address externally. And here's just a quote from the Bishard Inquiry report from 2004, which I think is just really pertinent. And it says, for agencies whose job it is to protect children and vulnerable people, the harsh reality is if a sufficiently devious person is determined to seek out opportunities to work their evil, no one can guarantee that they will be stopped. And our task is to make it as difficult as possible for them to succeed. And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Is whenever these things come to our attention, the school, the setting is absolutely shocked by what's happened, can't believe it's happened. And the dealing with the aftermath is very difficult. But if we get our recruitment practices as good as we can, and then we have our ongoing induction training and supervision and expectations very clear, hopefully we'll minimise any risk to children. Thank you, Hayden. That's as much as I wanted to cover now. We have run over very slightly, and I'm sorry for that. So does anybody have any questions, or is that okay for this afternoon session? There are full training sessions on safe recruitment. I do a full day session for schools on 2 or 3 times a year, and through the NYES training, settings can access safe recruitment training for settings, and also online on NSPCC they offer safe recruitment training as well. And so if you're not experienced in recruitment, then absolutely I would recommend you do one of those trainings. If anybody has any questions, then please get in touch with Hayden, who'll pass them on to me. But hope that's okay for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody who's presented today. Sorry that we've run over time, and apologies for the slight technical glitch at the beginning, but fortunately we got it all resolved. So thank you very much. We have one more session planned for this year, and then we'll be starting our 2023 sessions, which will be moving from the last Friday of the month to all but January and April, the first Wednesday lunchtime of the month instead. So it's going to be a different time, but you'll still be able to access the same sort of content. And don't forget, all of this information will be on our website and our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.